Hi, thanks so much for having me and for tuning into my presentation. My name is Josh Glaser, and I'm an assistant professor at Northwestern University. And today I'm going to be telling you a story about how we can use machine learning models, in particular these latent variable models, to test hypotheses about neuroscience. I'm going to be focusing on one very specific example about spinal motor control. So this project that I'm going to be talking about was a very close collaboration with Naja Marshall, who is a very talented, recently graduated student in Mark Churchland's lab. And I'll just be telling you kind of a part of this story today. And if you're interested in learning more, I've, on the bottom of this page, listed the reference for the full paper, where you can read about additional details. So our motor system is able to make a very wide range of forces. We can make small forces like holding a cup of coffee, or large like lifting weights. There can be static forces, again, like you don't want to shake your coffee too much, you want to hold it still, or rapidly changing, like lifting weights on the right. So we want to know, how does the motor system go about producing all these types of forces? And we're going to ask this question at the level of spinal motor neurons. So let me provide a little background about this system first. To make a muscle contract, a signal goes from the brain to motor neurons in the spinal cord that connect to muscle fibers. Now, each motor neuron connects to a unique set of muscle fibers, and this combination together is known as a motor unit. And this motor unit is the smallest controllable unit of the motor system. And the motor units that control a single muscle are together known as a motor neuron pool. So due to this neuroanatomy, where each muscle fiber is only innervated by a single motor neuron, something that is really nice is that you can stick an electrode into the muscle, and after a bit of sorting these waveforms of the neurons, you can get access to the activity of individual spinal motor neurons. So these motor units are very diverse. There are large motor units, which are those that connect to many fibers, and small motor units, those that connect to few fibers. And the large motor units will produce larger forces, and smaller units, smaller forces. The larger motor units will produce the forces more rapidly, and the small motor units will generate it more slowly. So we might think that there's a lot of flexibility in how the nervous system controls these motor units, since different ones might be optimal in different scenarios. For example, when we're trying to produce fast or slow forces. However, despite this diversity of motor units, the canonical theory of motor control, which has been around for over 50 years, argues that the nervous system uses a much simpler control strategy, sometimes known as the size principle. And this canonical theory, which is found in standard neuroscience textbooks, is that there's this single common input into an entire motor neuron pool, which you can think of like the intensity of the desired muscle force that's trying to be produced. And in this theory, as you need to increase the muscle force that's produced, motor units are recruited from smallest to largest, and their firing rates will increase together. So you get this increasing force by adding more and more motor units. And in this model, each motor unit, shown on the top, has some fixed relationship to the underlying force that you're trying to produce. And then as you need to decrease the muscle force, these motor units will turn off, they'll be kind of de-recruited in the opposite order. And so there's a lot of previous work that has supported this canonical theory. But importantly, this support has come from experiments that have these static, meaning non-changing, or very slowly changing forces. So we'll call this hypothesis the rigid control hypothesis, where there's this single common drive that controls all the motor units, and their activity are just a simple kind of monotonic function of that desired force. And the believed reason for this type of control is that it is much computationally simpler. The central nervous system doesn't need to figure out how to monitor each motor unit separately depending on the situation. The alternative is what we'll call flexible control, using more degrees of freedom, which, although more computationally complex, could seem advantageous when making many different types of forces, for example, fast and slow forces. And the central nervous system has 1,000,000 axons projecting down into the spinal cord. So it definitely is possible that it could take advantage of this type of diversity of the different motor units. So how are we going to differentiate between these hypotheses? We'll do it both through new experiments that my collaborators did, where the monkey creates a much wider range of force profiles than in classic experiments, and also through modeling, which is where I came in and which will be kind of a focus of this talk. Let me first describe what these experiments look like. So this monkey will control the height of Pac-Man on the screen. When monkey kind of pushes against this load cell, Pac-Man will rise, going along with the force, and when the monkey produces less force, Pac-Man will fall. So Pac-Man's height is directly related to the force that the monkey is producing. And we can put these scrolling dots across the screen, which will dictate essentially the force profile that the monkey needs to make. So the monkey will need to make whatever force is in the pattern of the dots that scroll across the screen. And so we essentially can get the monkey to make a large range of different force profiles in this paradigm. So let me show you a video to give you a slightly better idea of how this works in practice. To orient you to what you're seeing, on the top is that Pac-Man eating these little dots that are scrolling across the screen. And Pac-Man's height is being controlled by the monkey pushing against this load cell. And on the bottom here, you can see EMGs. This is for an individual channel in the recording. And on the left is a longer 1-second time window. So you can see kind of all this spiking activity. And on the right is a much shorter kind of 1 millisecond time window. So you can see that the monkey is very skilled in this task, much better Pac-Man than I or probably most of you are. So I only showed you a handful of trials in the video, but this figure shows all the force patterns that the monkey generated. So those that are kind of different static or non-changing, those that are slowly increasing up or down, things that are very rapidly oscillating in that bottom row. And I also want to mention that there were two completely additional experimental paradigms, one in which the monkey made forces in different postures, which changed the muscle length, and the second in which we stimulated the motor cortex to causally show the effects on motor unit recruitment. And today, I'm just going to be talking about these dynamic force experiments, so these conditions I'm showing on this slide, but the results from the other experiments have the same conclusion that I'll be talking about, relating to the flexibility of motor unit control. So let me first show you some example experimental data. So these are two motor units recorded during a condition where the monkey is kind of slowly increasing force and then slowly decreasing. And so we can see these two recorded motor units, and their activity seems to be consistent with this idea of rigid control, because like that little schematic I showed earlier, the activity of both these units is increasing their activity together and then decreasing their activity together. On the other hand, we can see some individual examples, in particular when we're looking across widely ranging force profiles that don't seem to support rigid control and support flexible control. So here's two motor units during the slowly increasing ramp condition, and then those same motor units during this fast 3 Hz oscillation. Now you can see here, while the blue motor unit increased its activity greatly, the red motor unit actually decreased. And this would be impossible in this rigid control hypothesis, as both motor units need to increase their activity together or decrease it together. You can't have one increasing while the other decreases. That would support this idea of flexible control. So we can see this individual example, but how can we assess this in a broad range of situations when we can record actually up to 20 motor units at once in some experiments? So our general modeling approach is that we have this data, the motor unit activity, and we want to incorporate this prior knowledge, this hypothesis of rigid control. And we're going to combine them to get this machine learning model that essentially embodies the rigid control hypothesis. We're going to fit that model to the motor unit activity data. And the general idea is that if this model, which is representing the rigid control hypothesis, cannot explain the data if it's making systematic errors in explaining the motor unit data is evidence against this idea of rigid control, which our hypothesis is kind of within the model. Now let me walk you through the model. So we have some common drive as a function of time, which we'll call X, which is the underlying input into the pool of motor units. And then each individual motor unit, its firing rate will be some function, F, of that underlying common drive. And this is going to be this monotonically increasing function, right? So as there's an increase in common drive, the firing rate of that motor unit will increase. And so we can see in a video here, right, as the common drive increases, the firing rate will increase as a function of it. And putting these two things together, right, we ultimately get that the firing rate as a function of time is going to be this link function, F, for each motor unit, as a function of X, that common drive. And so this is shown for one motor unit. But we, as I briefly mentioned before, can get up to 20 a session. It's generally between 3 and 20 on individual sessions. So we're going to have this final piece as given. So we know what those Y's are. We know what the motor unit activity is as a function of time. That's what we get out of our recordings. But we don't know these other two aspects. And these we need to learn within the model. We don't know what this potential common drive is. People think it may be closely related to force, but we don't really know what it is. We want to learn it within the model. And we also don't know how that common drive links to the firing rates of each motor unit. So we're going to learn that all kind of end to end within the model. And so another way of describing this model is it's a latent variable model where the link function at F is monotonic. So monotonically increasing as, again, you have increasing common drive, increasing firing rate. And we're going to fit this model with a technique called variational inference. A few more details about this model. So as I mentioned, we have these monotonic link functions, and we really want to have expressive link functions to give this kind of rigid control model the best chances possible of explaining the data. We don't want this model to fail because our functions were not flexible enough. We really want to give the model the best chance to explain the data, and only if it can't, then we can kind of say that we have evidence against this rigid control hypothesis. And so the way we'll parameterize these link functions in a flexible way, but where they're still monotonic, is using monotonic neural networks. So it'll be this kind of feed-forward neural network, but where all the weights are constrained to be positive, which means that as X, the input increases, the output will increase as well. And then we'll feed this through this kind of rectified linear unit because all firing rates are positive to get our output. And then one final detail of the model before I start to show you some results is that we have a few variations to, again, be even more flexible. So one is that we have a model with separate lags for each motor unit. So essentially, you could have a different latency between the common drive and an individual motor unit. For example, due to different conduction velocities to get to the motor unit. And we don't want to reject the rigid control model for a trivial reason, like differences in conduction velocities. So we want to be able to explain these within the model as well. And we also had fit a separate model, again, as a control that had separate internal dynamics for each motor unit. So essentially, it's kind of the small recurrent neural network for each motor unit that can explain internal dynamics as well. To explain kind of spinal mechanisms like persistent inward currents that are just internal. And the results I'm going to be showing you are from the model that have separate lags for each motor units, but all of the variations of models we fit support the same conclusions. Great, so what does our model fits look like on the actual data? So let's revisit this example experimental data that I showed you before that seemed to support the idea of flexible control. Now, if you recall, for a model of rigid control, this model that has a single latent variable that explains everything, to explain the data, we would need that the red to be higher in the 3 Hertz condition on the right than the slow ramp condition on the left, because the activity of both units needs to increase together. So we'd either need the prediction of the red to be higher to follow one latent model. So red in the 3 Hertz to be higher, or red in the slow ramp to be lower. And so now let me show you what the model fits look like. So first I'll just show you when we fit to individual conditions, not to both the slow ramp and the 3 Hertz together. And so when we fit to these individual conditions on the left and the right, we get these exceptionally good model fits. However, when we fit to both conditions together, we get exactly what we'd expect, is that we can undershoot on the left and overshoot on the right, because a one latent model that can explain this data would ultimately need to have kind of lower activity on the left than on the right for this red motor unit. So it does the best it can possibly do to fit this data, but it still can't explain it perfectly well. Again, kind of supporting in this example that this one latent model representing rigid control can't explain our data. But so how do we know that violations to this rigid control hypothesis are consistent though, and not just individual examples that may happen due to chance or due to noise? And so the way we'll address this is by splitting the data into halves of trials and fitting the model to both halves separately and seeing whether we get kind of consistent ways that the model fails instead of things just due to chance. So in this case, showing the actual activity averaged in 2 different halves of trials, and then the predictions. You can see, right, by eye, it looks like they're somewhat consistent. On the left, kind of early in the trial, there's overshooting, and on the right, towards the end of the trial, there's undershooting of the prediction. And so to quantify this, we're going to take the dot product of the errors, or the residuals, between the 2 halves. And if the errors were completely random, we'd expect this dot product to be 0. However, if the errors are consistent, they're both negative or both positive, then we'd expect this dot product to be positive. And so now what I'm going to plot here on the left, we're calling this kind of cross-validated error, is that dot product I just described on the previous slide. And so first I'm going to show you if we fit the model just to a slowly increasing ramp condition, and we'll compute the error within that condition as well. And this is a kind of condition that the classical rigid control theory has been able to explain well. And we can see that in general, this model does explain the data very well for just this slowly increasing ramp. However, if we now fit to all of the different experimental conditions, but I'm still, for a fair comparison, just going to compute the errors on this slow ramp condition. So it's an apples to apples comparison. And now we get a much larger consistent error, showing that this one latent model is not able to explain motor unit activity in these wide range of conditions together. And this is not just because we're fitting to more conditions. If we do a control where we actually generate the data from a one latent model, it doesn't matter how many conditions we'll have. We consistently get close to 0 error. And so another way that we can investigate the data to better understand kind of what is causing a violation of rigid control is to fit the model to pairs of conditions. And so here conditions are ordered roughly increasing with frequency. So on the kind of top and left, we have static conditions, very low frequency. And on the right and bottom, we have these kind of high frequency oscillatory conditions. And so if we fit the model to pairs of conditions, so here I show the static and the slow ramp. So these are both kind of classically experimental conditions. And if we fit our model to those together, we get very few violations. This one latent model can explain these slow static conditions very well, as we'd expect and consistent with previous results. However, if we then fit a slow condition, like a slowly increasing ramp, with a fast oscillatory condition, we start to get many more errors. And this trend is true across all pairs of conditions, that we have these violations according to the model, that we can't just have one common drive that simultaneously explains motor unit activity in both these kind of slow and fast conditions. So we've shown that this one latent model that represents the rigid control hypothesis cannot explain our data well, which naturally brings up the question, how many latents are needed to explain this data. So we adapted our model so that X now, that latent variable, is not just a single common drive, but this is something multidimensional. There's actually multiple latents that are going within the model, going through this still monotonic neural network. So as the activity of these different latents increase, the output Y will increase. And we're going to fit this multi-latent model to our data. And I'm going to plot the same error, that was this kind of dot product across the two halves of split data, but now as a function of the different latents. And I should mention, we just fit this kind of multi-latent model to individual sessions, two in particular that had the most simultaneously recorded neurons, which was between 15 and 20. And we can see that even when we're just fitting only to these individual recordings, which are fit to a subsection of one muscle, at least 3 and potentially more latents are needed, again suggesting that there's much more flexible control than previously thought by canonical theories. So to summarize, in this talk, we incorporated hypotheses about spinal motor control into latent variable models to test out these hypotheses, which I think in general is an exciting direction of fitting machine learning models to data to test scientific hypotheses. And we found specifically that there's greater flexibility over spinal motor unit control than proposed by canonical textbook theories. And as a couple ongoing and future directions I want to briefly mention, one is within these multi-latent models, right, that I mentioned we had at least 3 latents need to explain the data. Fitting them just naively to the data, it often is difficult to understand what is going on within those latent variables. We ultimately would like to be able to interpret them, to know these are the different kind of signals being used to control the motor unit. So for example, maybe there's one kind of controlling slower activity and one controlling faster activity. We don't know right now. And so developing models that we kind of disentangle these latent variables using techniques from machine learning in order to be able to better interpret what the signals are controlling the motor units. And then also, collaborators in the Turchin lab have recorded simultaneously from motor cortex using neuropixels. So we're very excited about the possibility of actually linking the cortical activity to the motor unit activity to better understand the basis of this flexible control through modeling approaches. And if these kind of projects are exciting to you, as a quick plug, my lab is hiring postdocs. So to wrap up, want to give a huge thanks to the many collaborators involved in this project, in particular, Najra Marshall and Mark Churchland, and a big thanks, of course, to all the funding sources that made this project possible. So thanks so much for your attention, and yeah, feel free to email me if you have any questions. Thanks again.